The winter of 1888 had been so mild on the U.S. East Coast, the mildest in nearly 2 decades, that by early March the trees were already beginning to bud. The robins were returning to the city. It was more than 50 degrees. It was so clearly the coming of spring that in March 10th, Walt Whitman, by then 78 years old, living in New Jersey, and the most celebrated poet in the country, if not the world, submitted a poem, a quaint, beautiful poem about the coming of spring called The First Dandelion, to the New York Herald for publication. Simple and fresh and fair from winter's close emerging, as if no artifice of fashion, business, politics had ever been, forth from its sunny nook of sheltered grass, innocent, golden, calm as the dawn, the spring's first dandelion shows its trustful face. The poem was published on March 12th. By then, it was comically ill-timed. The great blizzard of 1888 struck March 11th. The weather had, previous to the blizzard, been unseasonably warm, resulting in heavy rains. When cold Arctic air ran into the warm, wet air from the Gulf, temperatures plummeted, and the rain turned to snow. The result did not just create mounds of snow, up to 50 inches, but sustained high winds that earned the storm the moniker, the Great White Hurricane. The Nation's Weather Service, then under the auspices of the Army Signal Corps, knew of the winter storm coming from the west and the warm, wet front coming from the Gulf, but had predicted that both would be spent before reaching the East Coast. The weather forecast for March 11th was light rain. The people had no warning at all. The storm was in full swing on March 12th, yet many New Yorkers still set off for work. There were no worker benefits at the time to pay for days off for snow, and surely the trains would keep running. No one seemed prepared for what was to come. The commuter trains at the time were on elevated rails. They were first stalled due to ice and slick rails, with their small engines unable to find traction. Then by the depth of the snow, and finally by the accidents, as the trains that were still moving were unable to stop and collided with those that were not. Thousands of people were stranded in trains and stations. Enterprising New Yorkers brought out long ladders and charged a small fee to get people down from the elevated trains. The snow fell deep enough that the streetcars came off their tracks, and that service, too, was halted. As transportation was at a standstill, Roscoe Conkling, a former U.S. Senator and aspiring presidential candidate, still very fit and hale at the age of 58, set out on March 12th from his office to walk the 3 miles to his home. He found himself stuck in Central Park with snow up to his arms. He described it as near giving right up and sinking down there to die as a man can do, and not do it. It took him 3 hours to walk those 3 miles to safety. A harrowing tale, but not the end of the story. He contracted pneumonia and died 6 days later. Conkling was likely the most famous victim of the storm, but certainly not the only one. The Philadelphia Times detailed several of those lost. While the 23rd District officer was on his beat during the height of the storm yesterday morning, information was given him that the dead body of a woman had been found in a snowdrift just across the Delaware County line. It was supposed to be the body of a woman in a habit of gathering fern and mint leaves during the summer months, and from the appearance of the body, the presumption is that she was frozen to death. George Chrisman, a lightman at the signal tower near Saratoga, was run down by the Williamsport Express near Saratoga and instantly killed this morning. He had just been relieved from duty and was on his way home. The wind was blowing a gale, and he was blinded by the snow, and a train ran into him. A large pine tree on the north side of Christian Street fell to the ground, borne down by a large weight of frozen snow. A young lad named Joseph Brown was clearing the pavement when one of the branches struck him on the head. Harry Dreers, a Philadelphia and Reading coal train brakeman, was knocked from his train near Pottstown and fatally injured. The young man was standing on top of a boxcar when he was blinded by the snow and struck by an overhead bridge and thrown down on the tracks. The Boston Globe reported Robert H. Masterson, age 66, of Tuckahoe, was one of the passengers aboard a train which got stalled in a cut between Mount Vernon and Williamsbridge on Monday night. After being in the train several hours, Masterson, with a number of other passengers, started to walk towards the nearest station. He got separated from the other passengers and fell in the snow, exhausted. When his body was found, it was frozen stiff. He leaves a wife and 5 children. The Chicago Tribune reported a story from Elizabethport, New Jersey. Alexander Bennett, John Lee, and another employee of the Singer Sewing Machine Company left Elizabethport Monday in a small rowboat for Staten Island. The empty boat was found in the ice, far out of its course. It is thought the men reached Staten Island shore, but perished while crossing the meadow. The great blizzard of 1888 had, in fact, the highest death toll of any winter storm in U.S. history. In all, the storm and cold killed some 400 people along the coast from the mouth of the Chesapeake into Canada, 200 of those in New York City. The blizzard struck a vast swath of the East. The Philadelphia Times wrote, not only did it strike here, but it reached over Jersey, New York, and way down into Maine. Telegraph communication was almost entirely cut off midnight Sunday, but it was learned that the blizzard extended west to Ohio and south below Washington. As for Philadelphia, the paper said the storm was undoubtedly the worst chronicled in the last 50 years. It was thought to be the most severe of any known in the history of the Quaker City. The Morning Journal Courier of New Haven, Connecticut reported a veritable blizzard, the most terrible storm ever witnessed in this latitude. The Sacramento, California Record Union reported the effect on the nation's capital. The storm that visited Washington yesterday was one of the most remarkable for years. In fact, the capital seemed to have been the center of a miniature cyclone that brought with it a blinding succession of rain, snow, wind, and cold. News of the storm even reached across the ocean, with the Yorkshire Herald of North Yorkshire, England, noting, "The Stock Exchange, for the first time in its history, stopped business by a formal resolution, after it had already been stopped less formally, and without a resolution, by the blizzard and the snow." The blizzard was unique. The snowfall totals were not near records for the U.S. Northeast previously or since. The temperature lows were likewise no record, nor were the winds. What made the Great White Blizzard of 1888 unique was the unique combination of snow, wind, and cold, all at the same time. Snow drifted so high that in some places it covered fifth-floor windows. Hundreds of ships foundered or ran aground in the storm. Some 100 of the victims who died were sailors. More died because efforts to fight the cold led to fires, and the fire departments were unable to respond. Still, people managed to carry on. Trapped in anyway, the Ringling Brothers Circus performed 2 shows in Madison Square Garden as scheduled, mostly to people who were stranded and seeking shelter. While the Great Blizzard of '88 was one to remember, its impact was larger than other, statistically more powerful storms. The growing, thriving metropolises of the East at the time, now lit with electricity, connected by telegraphs, served by trains, heated by gas, had, in their modernization, become surprisingly vulnerable, as all of these were above the ground. The Baltimore Sun reported that telephone and telegraph wires and poles, weighted down with ice, were easily broken or overthrown. Trees were torn up by the roots, and railroads were blockaded by the snowdrifts. The downfall of telegraph wires cut off the city from communication with other points, and news was either delayed or completely lost. The Philadelphia Times wrote that railroad travel was almost entirely suspended. West Philadelphia was isolated from the center of the city as completely as if it were miles away, and the capital of the nation has been isolated from the world for the past 24 hours. New York was as far from Washington as before electric telegraphy was known. The Chicago Tribune provided a stark example. The best evidence of the complete isolation of New York today is the fact that telegraphs from Boston to the city were received this afternoon via the Atlantic cable from England, having been sent under the ocean to Europe and thence to New York. In no other way could access be gained to the city. In fact, the electricity wires, broken by heavy ice and high winds, were one of the greatest dangers to city dwellers. The storm drew comparisons to the West, which had suffered a terrific storm in January, which had killed several children in the plains and upper Midwest as they tried to make it home from school, earning the moniker the Children's Blizzard. The Philadelphia Times reported a comparison from someone with experience on the subject. Signal Service Officer Prender said, "I have served 15 years in Dakota in the Signal Service Department, and I have seen some pretty bad blizzards. And I can assure you, this one was a pretty bad one. This has been a genuine Dakota blizzard, and the worst you ever saw in this part of the country." Several papers wrote about citizens from the West sending aid, but the Black Hills Weekly Journal of Rapid City, Dakota Territory, couldn't help but take a swipe at their eastern brethren. While Dakota is basking in sunshine brighter than the East ever knows, New York is shivering amid the storms of winter. And yet the Eastern people presume to speak of the West as a bleak, inhospitable country. They know nothing of the West. As the people dug their way out from under the snow, their sense of resiliency and humor was shown. The Chicago Tribune wrote on March 15th that on Broadway the sidewalks were cleaned and all sorts of humorous signs were stuck up in the snow piles, such as "Keep off the grass," "You can have it if you will take it away," and the familiar Central Park notice, "Do not touch a leaf or a flower." Notably, one of the signs, the paper noticed, made an ironic reference to Whitman's poem. One had stuck up what he called the Blizzard Gazette, and under the titles were these lines of poetry. "Oh, where is the poet who wrote of the spring, and the birds, and the flowers, and the trees? They have hustled him off to the cold, cold north, and left him there to freeze." More than any other single event, the blizzard of '88 drove cities to move their utility lines and wires underground. It was a large motivation behind the building of the nation's first subway systems, including the nation's very first system, opened in Boston in 1897. The Great White Hurricane changed the very nature of a modern city. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.